Welcome back. Now, of late, South Africa's transformation policies have been a source of friction in the political arena. Government is currently mulling the idea of granting non-listed companies an automatic level 3 BEE compliance status if they pay 3% of their revenue to the State Transformation Fund. Now, is this a shortcut to compliance, a smart incentive, or a costly loophole? Stuart Theobald, founder and executive chair of Krutham, joins us to weigh in. Stuart, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Now, as mentioned, regulations around BEE have been a hot topic for some time, with some experts even saying that the T's and C's make the country less of an attractive investment destination. Now, this model that has been presented, right, sort of allows businesses, to buy BEE status by contributing 3% revenue. How viable is this model?
Well, for some businesses, it's going to be an attractive option. The alternative ways that you would obtain 3B status can be more costly. It takes a lot of management time, as well as spending to reach the required benchmarks to get points on the BEE scorecard. So for some companies, this will be a cheaper option, and they would use this option. But I think it really depends on the financial structure of the company, because this is a 3% fee at the top line against the revenue of a company. It's going to depend on how profitable they are and what kind of margins they run with. So many, for instance, mass market retailers operate at margins of just a few percent. For them, this would never work because they simply don't have the cash available to pay the 3%. But for other companies in, say, financial services, there are margins typically, as high as 20%. To pay a 3% top line fee would be quite feasible. So one of the things I think needs more thought in the design of the proposal is why we would levy the fee at the top line against the revenue of a company rather than a bottom line against the profit. Even if you're raising the same amounts, it's much more efficient to do at the bottom line because you don't create distorted incentives for companies or damage their risk profile, and you can raise the same amount of money.
And that was going to be my next question around whether the revenue-based tax is fair, whether it affects companies differently.
Yeah, so in most tax systems, you only tax profits, you don't tax revenues. Slightly different when you're charging royalties, for instance, to miners because they're consuming a fixed defined product out of the ground. And then it makes sense to charge a royalty against the total value of that. But generally, you wouldn't charge a tax to revenue levels. You would focus on companies' profits. And, companies should be aiming to maximize profits. That's their natural incentive. So by taxing at the profit level, you're ensuring that government benefits from a well-performing economy.
And Stuart, how might this proposed levy impact a company's approach to achieving triple BEE ownership requirements? Does that mean they can avoid giving up that 20% ownership to black shareholders? And if that's the case, what does this mean for transformation, for economic empowerment?
So it's a bit unclear in the proposals whether it's fully anticipated that the ownership component would be covered by this. I assume it must be, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense for companies. The ownership is the main expense that they would face. And to justify paying the 3% levy, they would need to benefit on the ownership line as well. I think in terms of the wider impact on BEE, what really matters is what that 3% money is actually spent on. Can we put it into a fund that's going to really effectively empower black-owned businesses to become successful and to achieve transformation? And is that outcome going to be more effectively done through the Transformation Fund than the alternative of companies doing ownership schemes and introducing black shareholders into their shareholding structure? We've got to test those two models against each other and decide which one is likely to be net beneficial, the best option. And to me, it's unclear whether the Transformation Fund is in fact going to be able to deliver outcomes that are superior to what the status quo, what typical ownership schemes do at the moment.
And from what I've gathered, there seems to be, a lack of confidence in government's ability to disperse funds fairly, judging from, the state's track record. How might we mitigate this? Should maybe the private sector get involved in dispersing funds as well?
Yeah, so I think this is the main concern. It's just the capacity to disperse funds, but also to complement the funds with the appropriate support that businesses need to grow. For many businesses, it's not about a lack of access to money. It's a lack of access to markets, a lack of access to the skills and capacity to know how to build up a business, to introduce governance, to have the right systems and processes to perform as a business. And the binding constraint that we see in many business development efforts done by the National Empowerment Fund to the Kula Enterprise Scheme and so on, is that complementary non-financial support that has to go alongside the financial support. Now, you need really experienced mentors who can work with company leaders, help them and guide them in establishing and growing their businesses. That is the much bigger problem to solve. And if you look at, say, the performance of the National Empowerment Fund, in fact, it sits with idle cash that it simply can't deploy because its binding constraint is the complementary support that it needs to be able to give to businesses. And the Transformation Fund is really talking about some very large numbers. So it's said that this 4% levy might raise 40 billion rand a year. Now, that's just an enormous number. Consider that the entire banking system lends about 250 billion rand to businesses, the entire book of banking lending to small businesses. So you're now talking about in the space of 4 or 5 years having enough cash to double what the entire banking system is currently doing in financing small businesses. It's enormous, and it's simply not feasible that we'll be able to create the business support necessary to ensure that that money is well spent and actually leads to the aim that we're trying to achieve, which is to create successful Black-owned businesses.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, Stuart. Thanks so much for your time and sharing your insights with us this afternoon. That was founder and executive chair of Krutham, Stuart Theobald.